Steve Harvey's elderly guest seemed fine during Seniors Week celebration until she fainted on live TV, and the shocking truth about her children's betrayal was exposed, proving that sometimes the worst abuse comes from the people who are supposed to love and protect us most. It was October 2024, and Steve Harvey was hosting his annual Seniors Week celebration, a week-long series of shows dedicated to honoring elderly Americans and their contributions to society. The week always featured inspiring stories of senior citizens who had overcome challenges, achieved remarkable things, or simply embodied the wisdom and dignity that comes with a life well lived. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, Steve was interviewing 78-year-old Margaret Foster, a retired elementary school teacher from Detroit who had supposedly been selected to appear on the show because of her 45 years of dedicated service to education. Margaret sat in the guest chair, wearing her best dress, a navy blue outfit that had seen better days but was clean and pressed, and a warm smile that made her seem like everyone's ideal grandmother. "Mrs. Foster, tell us about your teaching career," Steve said, settling into what he expected would be an uplifting conversation about a life dedicated to helping children learn and grow. "Well, Steve, I taught third grade for 45 years at Roosevelt Elementary School. I loved those children like they were my own. I must have taught over 2,000 students during my career." The studio audience was charmed by Margaret's gentle voice and obvious passion for education. She spoke about her favorite teaching memories, the students who had stayed in touch over the years, and the joy she had found in helping children discover their potential. "That's beautiful, Mrs. Foster," Steve said. "And I understand you have children of your own?" For just a moment, Margaret's warm expression flickered, and Steve noticed her hands tighten slightly in her lap. "Yes, I have 3 children. David is 52, Linda is 49, and Michael is 45. They're all adults now, of course, with families of their own. Do they live near you? Do you get to see your grandchildren often?" Again, that brief hesitation, that almost imperceptible shift in Margaret's demeanor. They stay busy with their own lives. You know how it is these days." Steve was experienced enough to recognize when a guest wasn't telling the whole story, but he didn't want to push Margaret into uncomfortable territory during what was supposed to be a celebration. He moved on to asking about her hobbies and interests in retirement. "I love to read," Margaret said, her smile returning. "I've always been a reader, and now I have more time for it. And I enjoy cooking, though I don't do as much of that anymore. I used to make a wonderful Sunday dinner. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans from my garden. I cooked Sunday dinner for my family for 30 years. Margaret's voice carried a wistful quality as she described those family dinners, and Steve could see genuine emotion in her eyes. "That sounds like a beautiful tradition, Mrs. Foster. Do you still host those family dinners?" This time the pause was longer, and Margaret looked down at her hands. Not anymore. Things have changed." Steve was about to ask another question when he noticed that Margaret was looking pale and seemed to be having trouble concentrating. "Mrs. Foster, are you feeling okay?" I feel a little dizzy. I haven't." Margaret started to say something but stopped herself. "Would you like some water?" Steve asked, concerned. "That would be nice," Margaret said weakly. A production assistant hurried over with a bottle of water, but as Margaret reached for it, her hand was shaking visibly. She took a small sip and set the bottle down carefully. "Mrs. Foster, when was the last time you ate today?" Steve asked, his instincts telling him that something was seriously wrong. Margaret looked at Steve with an expression of confusion and vulnerability that broke his heart. I had some crackers this morning, I think, or maybe that was yesterday." The studio audience was becoming concerned as they watched this sweet elderly woman struggle with what seemed like basic questions. "Margaret," Steve said gently, using her first name now, "are you having trouble remembering when you last had a meal?" "I'm sorry," Margaret said. tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I'm usually not like this. I'm usually very sharp. I just haven't been feeling well lately." And that's when Margaret Foster collapsed. She didn't fall dramatically from her chair, but rather seemed to simply deflate, her body going limp as consciousness left her. Steve immediately jumped up and caught her before she could hit the floor. "Get a doctor," Steve called to his crew. "Call 911. The studio erupted in concerned voices as medical personnel rushed to Margaret's side. Steve knelt beside her chair, holding her hand and talking to her softly as she drifted in and out of consciousness. "Margaret, stay with me. Help is coming. You're going to be okay." The paramedics arrived within 6 minutes and immediately began checking Margaret's vital signs. Her blood pressure was dangerously low, and she was severely dehydrated. "When was the last time she ate?" one of the paramedics asked. "She said she had crackers this morning, but she seemed confused about when that actually was," Steve replied. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" the paramedic asked Margaret. "When was your last full meal?" Margaret opened her eyes weakly. I don't remember. It's been hard to get groceries." "Why is it hard to get groceries?" Steve asked, kneeling beside the stretcher. I don't have a way to get to the store, and I don't have much money for food." Steve exchanged glances with the paramedic. Something about this situation didn't make sense. Margaret was well-dressed, articulate, and had supposedly been living independently. Why would she not have access to food or transportation? "Margaret, where do you live?" Steve asked. I've been staying at the Sunrise Motel on 8 Mile Road." Steve felt his heart sink. The Sunrise Motel was a run-down establishment in one of Detroit's roughest neighborhoods, the kind of place where people stayed when they had nowhere else to go. "Margaret, I thought you lived in your own home. Don't you have a house?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I used to. I lived in my house for 38 years. The house where I raised my children, where I cooked all those Sunday dinners." "What happened to your house?" Margaret's voice broke. "My children said I was too old to live alone. They said it was for my own good. They moved me out and sold the house. They said they would use the money to take care of me. But..." The truth was beginning to emerge, and Steve felt a rage building inside him that he struggled to control. "But what, Margaret?" "They took the money and said I could live with them, but then there was always a reason why I couldn't stay. David's wife said there wasn't room. Linda said she was too busy with her own family. Michael said his apartment was too small." Steve looked at the paramedics. "How long has she been malnourished?" "Based on her condition, I'd say she's been undernourished for at least several weeks, possibly longer." Steve turned back to Margaret. "Margaret, how long have you been living at that motel?" 4 months, she whispered. 4 months since they sold my house." The studio audience was in shock as the full scope of Margaret's situation became clear. This wasn't just a case of an elderly woman having trouble taking care of herself. This was systematic elder abuse by her own children. "Margaret, have your children been giving you any of the money from the sale of your house?" "They gave me $500 at first and said that had to last until they figured out long-term arrangements. But that was 3 months ago. And when I call them, they don't answer their phones." Steve stood up, his face a mask of controlled fury. He walked away from Margaret for a moment, processing the enormity of what he was hearing. Margaret's own children had convinced her to sell her home under the pretense of caring for her, taken the proceeds from that sale, and then abandoned her to live in a cheap motel, with no money for food or basic necessities. Steve returned to Margaret's side as the paramedics prepared to transport her to the hospital. "Margaret, do you have the contact information for your children?" "Yes, but they won't answer when I call." "They'll answer when I call," Steve said grimly. After Margaret was taken to the hospital for treatment of dehydration and malnutrition, Steve made a decision that would change the trajectory of the rest of the show and Margaret's life. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve addressed the studio audience and television viewers, "I need to share with you what just happened here. Mrs. Margaret Foster, the lovely retired teacher we were interviewing for Seniors Week, collapsed from hunger and dehydration because her own children stole her house, took her money, and abandoned her to live in a motel room. The audience was stunned into silence. This is elder abuse, plain and simple, and it's happening to elderly people all across this country. Children who convince their parents to sign over their homes and savings, then abandon them when they're most vulnerable. Steve's production team had been working behind the scenes to contact Margaret's children, and they had managed to reach David Foster, the eldest son. "I have David Foster on the phone," Steve announced. Margaret's eldest son who convinced his mother to sell her house and then left her to starve in a motel room. Steve took the phone call on live television. "David, this is Steve Harvey. I want to know why your 78-year-old mother is living in a motel room with no money for food, while you and your siblings have the proceeds from the sale of her house." David's voice was defensive and hostile. "That's none of your business. My mother's situation is a private family matter." "Your mother collapsed from hunger on my stage, David. She hadn't eaten in days. How is that a private family matter?" "My mother is confused and probably exaggerating. We've been trying to help her, but she's difficult to deal with." "David, your mother sold her house 4 months ago, and you've given her $500 total to live on since then. Where's the rest of the money?" "Like I said, that's not your business." Steve's voice became ice cold. "It became my business when your mother collapsed from starvation on my stage. And it's about to become a legal matter because what you've done to your mother is elder abuse, and it's criminal." Steve hung up the phone and addressed his audience. "Margaret Foster is not going back to that motel room. My foundation is going to make sure she has proper housing, medical care, and everything else she needs. And we're going to help her take legal action to recover the money her children stole from her." The response to Margaret's story was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of the show airing, Steve's foundation had received thousands of calls from viewers wanting to help. More importantly, the story sparked investigations into similar cases of elder abuse across the country. Margaret spent 3 days in the hospital, recovering from dehydration and malnutrition. When she was released, Steve's team had arranged for her to move into a beautiful assisted living facility where she would have her own apartment, 3 meals a day, medical care, and social activities with other residents. 6 months later, Margaret appeared on Steve's show again, this time healthy, well-fed, and radiant. "Margaret, how are you feeling?" Steve asked. "I feel wonderful, Steve. I feel like myself again. I'm eating regular meals, I've made friends at my new home, and I'm even volunteering to tutor children with reading." "What about your children?" "My attorney was able to recover most of the money from the sale of my house. It turns out they had spent some of it, but the legal pressure forced them to return the rest. I have enough money now to pay for my care for the rest of my life." "Have they tried to contact you?" "Yes, they have. They want to reconcile now that they know I have legal representation and public attention. But Steve, I've learned that family isn't just about blood relations. It's about people who actually care about your well-being." Margaret's story led to significant changes in elder abuse prevention and prosecution. Several states strengthened their laws protecting elderly people from financial exploitation by family members. And the story inspired thousands of people to check on elderly relatives and neighbors who might be suffering in silence. Steve established the Margaret Foster Elder Protection Fund, which provides legal assistance to elderly people who have been financially exploited by family members, and helps them recover stolen assets. Today, 79-year-old Margaret Foster is thriving in her assisted living community. She tutors children in reading twice a week, has written a memoir about her experience, and speaks to groups about elder abuse prevention. "The day I collapsed on Steve's show was the worst day of my life, but it was also the beginning of getting my life back," Margaret often says. "Sometimes you have to fall down completely before people can help you stand back up." Margaret's collapse on live television exposed a hidden epidemic of elder abuse and proved that sometimes the most powerful advocacy happens when someone's suffering becomes impossible to ignore, and the right person with a platform decides to act. If this shocking story of elder abuse exposed on live TV and one woman's journey from abandonment to dignity moved you, please subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to check on elderly relatives or neighbors who might be suffering in silence. Have you ever encountered elder abuse or helped an elderly person who was being mistreated by family? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to ring that notification bell for more stories about protecting our most vulnerable citizens and the importance of speaking up when we witness abuse.